A wealthy man, bedridden and battling illness, makes an impossible request to his nurse, one that could change both of their lives forever. As she stands at a crossroads, unsure whether to accept, she finds herself stepping into a world filled with secrets, challenges, and an unexpected connection that will redefine everything she thought she knew. What was this impossible request, and how could one choice alter the course of her entire future? The halls of St. Catherine's private hospital were quiet in the early hours of the morning, the air thick with the lingering scent of antiseptics. Outside, the first rays of sunlight were breaking through the horizon, casting a soft glow across the courtyard garden, visible from the large windows lining the corridors. Nurses moved quietly between rooms, their shoes barely making a sound against the polished floors, while the hum of machines created a steady backdrop of reassurance and routine. Emily Turner, a nurse in her late 20s, moved briskly down the hallway, her ponytail bouncing lightly with each step. She held a tray of medication in one hand and a clipboard in the other, her eyes scanning the patient list as she approached the door to room 418. Today was her day to tend to a particularly high-profile patient, Victor Astor, a name that held weight in business circles across the country. He was one of the wealthiest men in the nation, but that wealth hadn't protected him from the reality of a debilitating illness. Victor Astor was an enigmatic figure. At 52 years old, he was known for his influence in the financial world, his vast empire built on sharp instincts and relentless ambition. Yet those who worked at the hospital only saw the man behind the curtain, a man whose health had deteriorated, whose once commanding presence now seemed frail and fragile, confined to the sterile environment of a hospital room. Rumors swirled among the staff about his life, his wealth, his rumored estrangement from family, but Victor himself remained distant, guarded, his eyes often clouded with an unreadable mix of thoughts. Emily paused for a moment before knocking softly on the door. She took a deep breath and entered, offering a polite smile as she stepped inside. The room was spacious, with large windows that let in a soft morning light. Victor was seated in an armchair by the window, his silhouette framed by the warm glow of the sun. His appearance took Emily by surprise every time, a stark contrast to the images of him she had seen in magazines, where he exuded power and vitality. Now his face was gaunt, his hair graying, and his eyes seemed hollow, filled with the weight of countless untold stories. "Good morning, Mr. Astor," Emily said gently, her voice breaking the silence of the room. She approached him, setting down the tray on a nearby table, her gaze meeting his briefly. There was something in his eyes today, a depth that went beyond the usual exhaustion she was accustomed to seeing. He watched her for a long moment, his expression almost thoughtful. "Morning, Emily," Victor replied, his voice soft but still carrying a hint of the strength it once held. He shifted slightly in his chair, his gaze turning toward the garden outside. "I appreciate your punctuality," he added, his lips twitching in what might have been an attempt at a smile. Emily nodded, her own smile gentle as she began her routine, checking his vitals, adjusting his IV, and making notes on her clipboard. She spoke to him about mundane things, the weather, the flowers blooming in the garden, anything to fill the silence and offer a semblance of normalcy. She could tell that he appreciated the effort, even if he rarely said much in response. Today, however, felt different. There was an air of anticipation in the room, something unspoken that lingered between them. Victor's gaze kept drifting toward her, his eyes studying her with an intensity that made her pause. As she finished her tasks, she turned to him, her curiosity finally getting the better of her. "Is there something on your mind, Mr. Astor?" Emily asked softly, her eyes meeting his. She could see a flicker of hesitation in his expression, a moment of uncertainty that was rare for a man like him. Victor took a deep breath, his eyes shifting back to the garden. He was quiet for a moment, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest of his chair. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "There is something I need to ask you, Emily," he began, his tone laced with a vulnerability that took her by surprise. "Something unusual." Emily's brow furrowed slightly, her curiosity piqued. She set down her clipboard, giving him her full attention. "Of course, Mr. Astor. What is it?" she asked, her voice gentle, encouraging him to continue. Victor remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the garden, his expression distant. Finally, he turned to face her, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I need you to pretend to be my wife," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, the words hanging in the air between them. Emily blinked, her mind struggling to process what he had just said. She stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes wide with confusion. "Your wife?" she repeated, her voice filled with disbelief. She searched his face for some hint of a joke, some indication that he wasn't serious, but all she saw was the sincerity in his eyes, the plea that lay just beneath the surface. Victor nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I know it sounds absurd," he said, his voice filled with a mix of desperation and resignation. "But I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. There's a meeting I need to attend, and I need someone by my side, someone I can trust, someone who can pretend to be more than just a nurse." Emily's heart pounded as she tried to comprehend the magnitude of what he was asking. Pretend to be his wife? She had dealt with all kinds of unusual requests during her years as a nurse, but this was something entirely different. It wasn't about medical care or emotional support. It was about stepping into a role that went far beyond anything she had ever imagined. Victor's gaze softened, his expression filled with a vulnerability that made her heart ache. He looked away, his eyes once again finding the garden as he spoke. "I've spent my life building an empire, Emily. I've achieved things that others only dream of, but none of it means anything if I have no one to share it with. There are people who doubt me, who think I'm weak because I'm alone. This meeting, it's my chance to prove them wrong. But I can't do it without someone by my side." Emily swallowed hard, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what he was saying. She could see the pain in his eyes, the regret that seemed to weigh heavily on his shoulders. He was a man who had spent his life pursuing success, only to find himself alone at the end of it all. And now he was asking her to help him, to be the person who stood by his side when he needed it most. "Mr. Astor, Emily began, her voice trembling slightly. She wasn't sure what to say, how to respond to a request that seemed so impossible. She had always prided herself on her professionalism, on her ability to maintain boundaries with her patients. But as she looked at Victor, she could see the desperation in his eyes, the silent plea for her to understand. Victor turned back to her, his eyes filled with emotion. "Please, Emily," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I know it's a lot to ask, but I don't have anyone else. You're the only person I trust." Emily felt her heart ache at his words, the sincerity in his voice cutting through her uncertainty. She took a deep breath, her mind still reeling, but she knew that she couldn't turn away from him, not when he was asking for her help, not when he had no one else to turn to. Slowly, she nodded, her eyes meeting his. "All right, Mr. Astor," she said softly. "I'll do it. I'll pretend to be your wife." Victor's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. For a moment, he seemed at a loss for words, his gaze searching hers as if to make sure he had heard her correctly. Then slowly, his lips curved into a small, grateful smile, a smile that spoke of a man who had been given a second chance. "Thank you, Emily," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You have no idea what this means to me." Emily gave him a small smile, though her heart was still pounding, her mind racing with questions. She had no idea what she was getting herself into, no idea what this meeting entailed, or what kind of world she was about to step into. But as she looked at Victor, she knew that she couldn't turn back now. She had made a choice that would change both of their lives forever. And as she left the room, her thoughts were filled with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She had no idea what lay ahead, no idea what kind of challenges she would face. But she knew one thing for certain: her life would never be the same again. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. and Emily found herself stepping into a role she never imagined she would play. The impossible request Victor had made still echoed in her mind. Pretending to be his wife was not just a matter of putting on a ring or playing dress-up. It was about entering a different world, one filled with expectations, scrutiny, and the pressure of fitting into a life that was so far removed from her own. She felt the weight of it more each day, and yet she couldn't help but feel an unexpected sense of determination. Victor needed her, and she wouldn't let him down. The morning of the meeting arrived sooner than she expected, and as Emily stood in front of her small closet, she realized she had nothing even close to what was required for such an occasion. She had spent her career in comfortable scrubs and practical clothes, but today, she needed something that would match the opulence of Victor's world, something that would allow her to blend in seamlessly with the kind of people he would be meeting. Victor, ever the planner, had anticipated this. The evening before, a personal shopper had arrived at the hospital with a selection of dresses, jewelry, and shoes, each one more luxurious than the next. Emily had been overwhelmed, her modest upbringing making her feel almost embarrassed to touch the fine fabrics and sparkling gems that had been laid out for her. But Victor had insisted, his eyes filled with gratitude and something else, something that looked almost like hope. Now, as she slipped into the elegant navy blue gown that had been chosen for her, Emily couldn't help but feel like an imposter. The dress hugged her figure in all the right places, the fabric flowing gracefully around her as she moved. She looked in the mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. Her hair had been styled into soft waves that framed her face, her makeup subtle but enhancing her features in a way that made her look polished, sophisticated. She was no longer Emily Turner, the nurse. She was Emily Astor, the wife of a millionaire, a role she wasn't sure she could play convincingly, but one she was determined to try. Victor was waiting for her in the hospital's private garage, the car already idling as he leaned against it, his expression pensive. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored black suit, his tie a deep shade of blue that matched her dress. When he looked up and saw her approaching, his eyes widened slightly, a flicker of something passing across his face. Admiration, perhaps, or maybe just surprise at the transformation. "You look incredible," Victor said, his voice filled with genuine awe. He pushed himself off the car, stepping towards her, his eyes never leaving hers. Emily felt her cheeks flush under his gaze, and she gave him a small smile, her nerves still bubbling beneath the surface. "Thank you," she replied softly. She looked down at herself, then back up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I hope I can pull this off." Victor reached for her hand, his fingers warm as they wrapped around hers. "You'll do just fine, Emily," he said, his voice steady, reassuring. "Just be yourself. That's all I need." Emily nodded, taking a deep breath as Victor opened the car door for her, helping her inside. As she settled into the plush leather seat, she glanced at Victor, who had moved to sit beside her. She could see the tension in his posture, the way his fingers drummed lightly against his knee. He was nervous, she realized, not just about the meeting, but about what it meant, about the stakes that were involved. The drive was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound as they moved through the city. Emily watched as the streets changed, the buildings growing taller, the cars more expensive. They were headed to one of the most exclusive clubs in the city, a place where only the wealthiest and most influential people gathered, a place Emily had never even dreamed she would set foot in. Victor glanced at her, his eyes softening as he saw the anxiety in her expression. He reached for her hand again, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You don't have to say much," he said quietly. "Just stand by my side, smile when necessary, and let me handle the rest." Emily nodded, her heart pounding as the car came to a stop in front of the club. She could see the doorman standing at attention, the sleek cars lining the entrance, the flashes of cameras as photographers tried to catch a glimpse of the guests. This was Victor's world, a world of luxury, of power, of constant scrutiny. And today it was her world too. Victor stepped out first, his hand extended to help her out of the car. Emily took it, her fingers trembling slightly as she rose to her feet, her eyes scanning the crowd. She could feel the eyes on her, the curious gazes of people trying to figure out who she was, the whispers that followed as they walked towards the entrance. Victor's arm slipped around her waist, his touch gentle but grounding. He leaned in, his voice a soft whisper in her ear. "You're doing great," he said, his words meant to comfort her. Emily gave him a small nod, her eyes forward as they entered the club. The interior was grand, with high ceilings, chandeliers that sparkled above, and a polished marble floor that seemed to stretch endlessly. The air was filled with the soft murmur of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the faint strains of classical music playing in the background. It was elegant, opulent, and overwhelming. They were led to a private room at the back of the club, a room that was even more lavish than the main hall. Victor guided her to a seat beside him at the large table, where a few other men and women were already seated. They were all dressed impeccably, their expressions guarded, their eyes sharp as they took in the sight of Victor and Emily. "Victor," one of the men said, his voice smooth, his smile polite but not warm. "It's good to see you. And who is this lovely lady?" His gaze shifted to Emily, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to place her. Victor smiled, his arm resting on the back of Emily's chair, his fingers brushing against her shoulder in a gesture that seemed both possessive and protective. "This is my wife, Emily," he said, his voice steady, confident. "She insisted on accompanying me today." Emily forced a smile, her heart pounding as she nodded politely to the man. She could feel the weight of their scrutiny, the way they were assessing her, trying to figure out who she was, if she truly belonged. It was a test, she realized, a test of whether she could fit into this world, whether she could play the role that Victor needed her to play. The conversation began, and Emily did her best to keep up, her eyes drifting between the faces at the table, her mind trying to make sense of the jargon, the business terms, the subtle barbs that were exchanged like polite pleasantries. She could see that Victor was in his element here, his voice calm, his words measured, his eyes sharp as he navigated the conversation with ease. He was no longer the frail man she had seen in the hospital. He was the powerful, confident Victor Astor, the man who had built an empire from the ground up. But there was tension beneath the surface, an undercurrent of distrust that seemed to linger between Victor and the others at the table. Emily could sense it in the way they spoke to him, in the way their smiles never quite reached their eyes. They were not just colleagues, they were rivals, each one vying for power, for influence, each one waiting for the other to slip. As the meeting continued, Emily found herself watching Victor closely, her heart aching as she saw the strain in his eyes, the effort it took for him to maintain the facade of strength. She could see how much this meant to him, how much he needed to prove himself to show that he was still capable, still powerful, despite the illness that had taken so much from him. There was a moment, a brief pause in the conversation, when one of the men, an older gentleman with a sharp gaze and a cold smile, leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Victor. "You know, Victor," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "rumor has it that you've been struggling lately. Health issues, financial setbacks. It's a lot for one man to handle. Are you sure you're up to it?" The words hung in the air, a challenge, a provocation. Emily felt her breath catch, her eyes darting to Victor, her heart pounding as she saw the way his jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing slightly. This was what he had feared. This was why he had needed her here, to show that he wasn't alone, that he still had support. Victor smiled, a slow, calculated smile that didn't reach his eyes. He reached for Emily's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, as he turned to face the man. "I appreciate your concern," he said, his voice cool, composed. "But as you can see, I'm not alone. I have my wife by my side, and together we're more than capable of handling anything that comes our way." Emily felt her heart swell at his words, her eyes meeting his, a small smile tugging at her lips. She could see the strength in his gaze, the determination that had brought him this far, and she knew that no matter what happened, she would stand by him. She would be the support he needed. The man's smile faltered slightly, his eyes narrowing as he looked between Victor and Emily. He gave a small nod, his expression tightening. "Well, I wish you both the best," he said, his voice laced with insincerity. Victor nodded, his eyes never leaving the man's. "Thank you," he replied, his tone dismissive, his attention already shifting away from the man as if he were of no consequence. The rest of the meeting passed without incident, but Emily could feel the tension lingering, the unspoken challenge that had been issued, the subtle threats that lay beneath the surface. When the meeting finally ended, Victor stood helping Emily to her feet, his arm once again slipping around her waist as they made their way out of the room. As they stepped into the cool night air, Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She looked up at Victor, her eyes searching his face. He looked tired, the lines of strain etched into his features. But there was also a sense of relief, of triumph. "Thank you, Emily," Victor said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. "You were amazing tonight. I couldn't have done it without you." Emily smiled, her heart swelling with pride and affection. "I'm just glad I could help," she replied softly. She reached up, her hand resting on his cheek, her eyes filled with emotion. "You're stronger than you think, Victor, and I'll be here no matter what." Victor's eyes softened, his lips curving into a small smile. He leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, his voice barely a whisper. And that makes all the difference. As they stood there, the city lights glowing around them, Emily knew that this was just the beginning, that there would be more challenges, more battles to fight. But she also knew that as long as they had each other, they could face whatever came their way. The days following the high-profile meeting brought a sense of relief, but also a lingering uncertainty. Emily and Victor had managed to hold their own, presenting a united front against those who questioned Victor's strength and resilience. Yet, beneath the surface, Emily could see the toll it had taken on Victor. His health had been stable, but the stress of maintaining his public image, of pretending to be untouchable, was wearing him down. Emily found herself spending more time at Donovan Manor, where Victor had chosen to recover after his most recent hospital stay. The mansion was grand, filled with echoes of its past glory, high ceilings, sprawling rooms, ornate furniture that spoke of Victor's wealth and status. But despite the opulence, there was a loneliness about the place, an emptiness that seemed to seep into every corner. One afternoon, Emily was in the library, a book resting on her lap as she watched the rain pour outside. The large windows offered a view of the gardens, which were drenched by the steady downpour, the once bright flowers now wilting under the weight of the storm. She had always found the rain comforting, a reminder of renewal and cleansing, but today, there was a heaviness in the air that she couldn't quite shake. Victor entered the room quietly, his footsteps barely audible on the plush carpet. He looked tired, his face pale, the lines of stress etched into his features. Emily looked up as he approached, her heart aching at the sight of him. She set the book aside, her eyes meeting his. "You look exhausted, Victor," she said gently, her voice filled with concern. "Have you been resting at all?" Victor gave her a small, tired smile, shaking his head as he took a seat beside her. "There's too much to think about," he replied, his voice soft. He leaned back, his eyes closing for a moment as if trying to block out the world. Emily reached for his hand, her fingers brushing against his. "You can't keep pushing yourself like this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You need to take care of yourself." Victor opened his eyes, his gaze meeting hers. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, a weariness that made her heart ache. He took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around hers. "There's something I need to tell you, Emily," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "Something I've been avoiding because I didn't know how to say it." Emily frowned, her heart sinking at the uncertainty in his voice. She shifted closer to him, her eyes filled with concern. "What is it, Victor?" she asked softly. "You know you can tell me anything." Victor hesitated, his eyes dropping to their joined hands. He was quiet for a long moment, the weight of his thoughts evident in the way his shoulders slumped. Finally, he looked up at her, his eyes glistening with emotion. "The meeting the other night. It wasn't just about my business. he said quietly. It was about everything I've built. My company, my assets, everything is on the line. He paused, his gaze shifting away from hers, his jaw tightening. I've made some mistakes, Emily. I trusted the wrong people, and now everything I've worked for is at risk. If I can't find a way to fix it, I could lose everything. Emily felt her heart sink, her mind reeling at his words. She could see the pain in his eyes, the regret that seemed to weigh heavily on his shoulders. She reached up, her hand gently resting on his cheek, her voice filled with emotion. Victor, I'm so sorry, she whispered. I had no idea. Victor shook his head, his eyes closing as he leaned into her touch. I didn't want you to know, he said, his voice breaking. I wanted to protect you from all of this, but I can't do it alone anymore. I need your help, Emily. I need you more than ever. Emily felt tears welling in her eyes, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. She had seen Victor at his strongest, his most confident, but now as he sat before her, she could see the fear, the uncertainty that lay just beneath the surface. She leaned forward, her forehead resting against his, her voice barely a whisper. I'm here, Victor, she said softly. Whatever you need, I'm here. We'll get through this together. Victor's eyes opened, his gaze meeting hers. There was a flicker of hope in his eyes, a glimmer of something that had been lost for far too long. He took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around hers. Thank you, Emily, he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. I don't know what I'd do without you. The following days were filled with tense conversations, late-night phone calls, and urgent meetings. Victor was fighting to keep his empire from crumbling, and Emily was by his side every step of the way. She had never been involved in the world of high finance, but she was determined to help in any way she could, whether it was keeping Victor organized, providing emotional support, or simply being there when he needed someone to lean on. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Victor and Emily sat together in the study, the room dimly lit by the glow of the fireplace. Victor looked worn, his face lined with exhaustion, but there was also a determination in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He turned to Emily, his eyes filled with gratitude. You know, he began, his voice soft. I used to think that being strong meant doing everything on my own, that asking for help was a sign of weakness. He paused, his gaze dropping to their joined hands. But you've shown me that real strength comes from letting others in, from allowing yourself to be vulnerable. Emily felt tears welling in her eyes, her heart swelling with love for the man beside her. She leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. You don't have to do this alone, Victor. You have me, and I will always be here for you. Victor smiled, his eyes glistening with emotion. He leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, his voice filled with love. And that makes all the difference, he whispered. The turning point came one evening when a letter arrived at Donovan Manor. It was delivered by hand, the envelope unmarked, the paper thick and expensive. Victor opened it with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the words, his face growing paler with each passing second. Emily watched, her heart pounding, as she saw the color drain from his face. Victor? She asked, her voice filled with concern. She moved closer, her hand resting on his arm. What is it? Victor didn't answer at first, his eyes still fixed on the letter. Finally, he looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. It's a threat, he said quietly, his voice trembling. They're threatening to take everything, my company, my assets, everything I've worked for, and they're using us as leverage. Emily felt her heart stop, her mind reeling at his words. Us? She repeated, her voice barely audible. Victor nodded, his eyes filled with pain. They know about you, Emily. They know that you're important to me, and they're using that against me. They want me to step down, to give up everything, or they'll come after you. Emily felt a chill run down her spine, her heart pounding in her chest. She could see the fear in Victor's eyes, the desperation that lay just beneath the surface. She took a deep breath, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. "Victor, we can't let them win," she said, her voice filled with determination. "We can't let them scare us into giving up." Victor looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and love. He took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around hers. "I don't want to put you in danger, Emily," he said, his voice breaking. "I can't lose you, not now, not after everything we've been through." Emily shook her head, her eyes meeting his. "You're not going to lose me, Victor," she said firmly. "We'll fight this together. We'll find a way." Victor took a deep breath, his eyes searching hers. He could see the determination in her gaze, the strength that had always been there, the strength that had kept him going when he had wanted to give up. He nodded slowly, his heart swelling with love for the woman before him. "Together," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "We'll fight this together." And as they stood there, the letter crumpled in Victor's hand, Emily knew that this was the turning point, the moment that would define their future. They had faced challenges before, but this was different. This was a battle for everything they had built, for everything they had fought for, and they would face it together, no matter what. The following days were a blur of meetings with lawyers, discussions with trusted advisors, and long hours spent strategizing. Victor was determined to fight back, to protect everything he had built, and Emily was by his side every step of the way. She could see the toll it was taking on him, the sleepless nights, the constant stress. But she also saw the fire in his eyes, the determination that had carried him through so many challenges before. One evening, as they sat together in the study, Victor looked at Emily, his eyes filled with emotion. "I've been thinking a lot about what matters most to me," he said quietly. "And it's not the company, or the money, or the power. It's you, Emily. It's us." Emily felt tears welling in her eyes, her heart swelling with love for the man beside her. She reached for his hand, her voice trembling as she spoke. "You mean everything to me too, Victor, and I will be here no matter what happens." Victor nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, his voice barely a whisper. "I love you, Emily," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "And I will fight for us, for our future, no matter what it takes." Emily smiled, her eyes filled with tears as she looked at the man she loved. "And I love you, Victor," she whispered. "We'll get through this. Together." And as they sat there holding each other, Emily knew that they had reached the turning point, the moment that would define their future. They had faced challenges before, but this was different. This was a battle for everything they had built, for everything they had fought for, and they would face it together no matter what. The days that followed were some of the most challenging that Emily and Victor had ever faced. The threat against Victor's empire, and more painfully against Emily, had shaken them both to their core. It was one thing to fight for a business, to protect one's financial interests, but it was another to protect the person who had become the most important part of one's life. Victor was determined to fight, but there was a fear in his eyes now, a fear that went beyond the boardrooms and power plays, a fear of losing the one person who had given his life meaning. Victor's lawyers and advisors worked around the clock, trying to piece together the full scope of the threats they were facing. It became evident that a rival group, one with powerful interests and extensive resources, was behind the effort to undermine Victor's business. They were ruthless, willing to do whatever it took to see him fall, and they knew exactly where to strike to hurt him the most. They knew about Emily. It was one of Victor's lawyers, an old family friend named Harold, who suggested they leave Donovan Manor. "For your safety," Harold had said, his expression grave. "If they know where you are, you're both vulnerable. It's time to take measures to protect yourselves, especially Emily." Victor had agreed, though the decision weighed heavily on him. Donovan Manor was his sanctuary, the place where he had grown up, and the place where he had found love again. But he couldn't take any risks. He couldn't put Emily in harm's way. And so they left, the mansion's grand doors closing behind them as they drove away. The place that had once been filled with life and hope now standing empty, a reminder of what was at stake. They moved to a secluded property owned by one of Victor's trusted friends, an estate hidden away in the countryside, surrounded by tall trees and rolling hills. It was a beautiful place, peaceful and quiet, far removed from the chaos of the city and the pressures of Victor's world. But it was also isolating, and as the days passed, Emily could see the toll it was taking on Victor. He was used to being in control, used to facing his challenges head-on, and now he was forced to retreat, to hide, while others fought his battles for him. Emily, too, felt the weight of their new reality. She missed the freedom of her normal life, the ability to walk down the street without looking over her shoulder, to go to work, to see her friends. She missed the hospital, the sense of purpose that her work had always given her. But more than anything, she hated seeing Victor like this, tired, restless, his eyes filled with a frustration that he couldn't seem to shake. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the estate, the sun setting behind the hills, Victor turned to Emily, his expression filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "I never wanted this for you," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "I never wanted you to be caught up in my mess." Emily reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, her eyes filled with love. "Victor, this isn't your fault," she said softly. "I chose to be here. I chose to stand by you no matter what." Victor looked at her, his eyes glistening with emotion. "But you deserve so much more," he whispered, his voice filled with regret. "You deserve a life without fear, without threats. I hate that you're paying the price for my mistakes." Emily shook her head, her heart aching at the pain in his voice. She reached up, her hand gently cupping his cheek, her thumb brushing away a tear that had slipped down his face. "I don't see it that way," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I see a man who is fighting for what he believes in, who is trying to do the right thing. I see a man who has given me more love and purpose than I ever imagined possible. I'm not afraid, Victor. Not as long as we're together." Victor closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, his heart swelling with love for the woman beside him. He took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around hers. "I don't know what I did to deserve you," he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. Emily smiled, her eyes filled with tears. "You don't have to deserve me, Victor," she replied softly. "You just have to let me love you." And in that moment, Victor knew that no matter what happened, no matter what challenges they faced, they would face them together. They had each other, and that was enough. Over the next few weeks, they settled into a routine at the estate. It wasn't the life they were used to, but they made it work. Emily found ways to keep herself busy, helping out with chores around the property, spending time in the garden, and making meals for the two of them. She had always loved cooking, and she found comfort in the simple act of preparing food, of creating something that could bring a bit of joy to their otherwise uncertain days. Victor, meanwhile, spent hours on the phone with his lawyers and advisors, working tirelessly to find a way to protect his business and, more importantly, to protect Emily. He was determined to fight back, to regain control of his life, and he knew that the only way to do that was to face his enemies head-on. One afternoon, as Emily was working in the garden, she heard Victor calling her name. She looked up, her hands covered in soil, her heart skipping a beat at the urgency in his voice. She stood, brushing off her hands as she walked towards the house, her eyes filled with concern. "Victor?" she called, her voice filled with worry. She found him in the study, his phone in his hand, his expression filled with a mixture of disbelief and hope. "They've found something," Victor said, his voice trembling. He looked at her, his eyes wide. "Harold and the team. They've found evidence that could turn this whole thing around. Proof that the people behind this have been acting illegally, that they've been manipulating the system to try to take me down." Emily felt her heart leap, her eyes widening in surprise. "Victor, that's amazing," she said, her voice filled with hope. She moved closer, her hands resting on his arms, her eyes searching his. "What does this mean? Can we fight back now?" Victor nodded, his expression filled with determination. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. "It means we have a chance. We can take this to court. We can expose them for what they are. We can fight back." Emily felt tears welling in her eyes, her heart swelling with hope. She reached up, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him into a tight hug. "We're going to get through this, Victor," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "We're going to win." Victor held her close, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. He knew that they still had a long road ahead of them, that the fight was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. A sense that maybe, just maybe, they could come out of this stronger than before. The following weeks were filled with preparations for the legal battle that lay ahead. Victor and his team worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, preparing their case, and making sure that every detail was accounted for. Emily was by his side every step of the way, offering her support, her love, and her unwavering belief in him. One evening, as they sat together in the study, Victor looked at Emily, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and gratitude. "You know," he began, his voice soft, "I don't think I could have done any of this without you. You've been my strength, Emily. You've kept me going when I wanted to give up." Emily smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. She reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "And you've been mine," she replied softly. "We're in this together, Victor, no matter what." Victor leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, his voice barely a whisper. "No matter what," he repeated, his heart swelling with love for the woman beside him. The day of the court hearing arrived, and Emily could feel the tension in the air as they prepared to leave the estate. Victor was dressed in a dark suit, his expression calm but determined. Emily stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that this was it, the moment they had been fighting for, the moment that would determine their future. As they arrived at the courthouse, the media was already gathered, their cameras flashing, their voices calling out questions. Victor held Emily's hand tightly, his eyes forward, his expression focused. He had faced the media countless times before, but this was different. This was personal. This was about protecting the woman he loved, about fighting for their future. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Victor's lawyers presented their case, laying out the evidence they had gathered, the proof of the illegal actions taken by those who had sought to bring him down. Emily watched, her heart pounding, her eyes never leaving Victor's face. She could see the determination in his eyes, the strength that had carried him through so many challenges. As the hearing progressed, Emily felt a sense of hope growing within her. The evidence was strong, the arguments compelling, and she could see the way the judge listened intently, the way the opposing side shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was their chance. This was the moment they had been fighting for. When the judge finally spoke, her voice filled the courtroom, her words clear and decisive. "Based on the evidence presented, it is clear that the actions taken against Mr. Astor were unlawful. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Victor Astor." Emily felt her breath catch, her heart swelling with emotion as she looked at Victor. He turned to her, his eyes wide with disbelief, a smile slowly spreading across his face. He reached for her, pulling her into his arms, his voice filled with emotion. "We did it, Emily," he whispered, his voice breaking. "We did it." Emily held him tightly, tears streaming down her face, her heart filled with love and relief. "I knew we would," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I knew we could do it together." Victor pulled back, his eyes meeting hers, his gaze filled with love. He leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her lips, his heart swelling with gratitude for the woman who had stood by him through it all. And as they walked out of the courthouse hand in hand, the cameras flashing around them, Emily knew that they had faced their greatest challenge yet, and they had come out stronger on the other side. The future was still uncertain, but they had each other, and that was enough. They had overcome the darkness, and now, together, they would face whatever lay ahead, their love stronger than ever, their bond unbreakable, The courtroom victory had brought a sense of relief and triumph that Emily and Victor hadn't felt in a long time. They had fought back against the forces that had sought to destroy them, and they had won. But even in the face of their victory, there was a lingering tension, a knowledge that the fight wasn't truly over. Their enemies had been exposed, but the repercussions were yet to be fully felt. Victor was determined to make sure that those who had wronged him were held accountable, that justice would be served. He knew that the people behind the plot against him were powerful, that they wouldn't go down without a fight. And he also knew that this was about more than just protecting his business. This was about protecting Emily, about making sure that no one would ever threaten her again. A few days after the court ruling, Victor received a call that shook him to his core. It was Harold, his lawyer, and longtime family friend. His voice was tense, filled with urgency. "Victor, there's something you need to know," Harold said, his tone serious. "The people we went up against, they're not backing down. We've intercepted some communications and it looks like they're planning something else. They're desperate, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to take you down." Victor's heart sank, his mind racing as he processed Harold's words. He glanced at Emily, who was sitting across the room, her eyes filled with hope as she worked on some plans for the foundation they had started together. She had been so happy since the court victory, so full of optimism for their future. The thought of anything happening to her made his blood run cold. "What do you mean, Harold?" Victor asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are they planning?" Harold hesitated, his voice filled with a mix of fear and frustration. "We don't know all the details yet, but it sounds like they're planning to come after you personally, maybe even Emily. They want to make sure you're out of the picture for good." Victor felt his breath catch, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't let anything happen to Emily. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her. Not now, not after everything they had been through. He took a deep breath, his jaw set with determination. "We'll do whatever it takes to protect her," he said, his voice filled with resolve. "Whatever it takes, Harold." Harold agreed, his voice steady. "I've already increased security at Donovan Manor, and I'll make sure we have people watching the estate as well. We're going to keep both of you safe, Victor." Victor hung up the phone, his mind still reeling, his heart heavy with the weight of the new threat. He looked at Emily, who was still sitting across the room, her face illuminated by the soft afternoon light. She looked so peaceful, so full of hope for their future, and Victor knew that he couldn't let anything take that away from her. He crossed the room, his footsteps soft on the polished wooden floor. Emily looked up as he approached, her face breaking into a smile. "Hey," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "Is everything okay?" Victor nodded, his expression softening as he looked at her. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. "There's something I need to tell you, Emily," he said quietly, his voice trembling slightly. He could see the concern in her eyes, the way her smile faltered as she looked at him. "What is it?" she asked, her voice filled with worry. Victor took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. "There's still a threat," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The people who tried to take us down, they're not done yet. They're planning something, and it might be dangerous. Harold's already working on increasing security, but I need you to be careful." Emily felt her heart sink, her mind reeling at his words. She could see the fear in his eyes, the way his hand trembled as he held hers. She took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering as she looked at him. "Victor, we've faced threats before," she said softly. "We got through it then, and we'll get through it now. Together." Victor nodded, his heart swelling with love for the woman before him. He leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, his voice filled with emotion. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Emily," he whispered. Emily smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "You'll never have to find out," she replied softly. "We're in this together no matter what." That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Victor and Emily found themselves sitting on the back porch of the estate, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers and the distant sound of crickets. The sky was a deep shade of indigo, the stars beginning to twinkle above, and there was a sense of stillness, of calm that seemed to settle over them. Victor took a deep breath, his eyes drifting to the horizon, his mind still filled with thoughts of the threat that loomed over them. He knew that they were not out of danger yet, that there were people who wanted to see him fall, who were willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. But as he looked at Emily, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the moon, he knew that he would do anything to protect her, to keep her safe, no matter the cost. "Victor?" Emily's voice broke through his thoughts, her eyes filled with concern as she looked at him. "What are you thinking about?" Victor turned to her, his eyes softening as he reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "I'm thinking about you," he said softly. "I'm thinking about how much I love you and how I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." Emily smiled, her heart swelling with love for the man beside her. She leaned in, her forehead resting against his, her voice barely a whisper. "And I love you," she replied. "We'll get through this, Victor. We've faced so much already and we're still here. We're stronger than they think." Victor closed his eyes, his heart swelling with emotion. He knew that she was right. They had faced so many challenges, so many battles, and they had come out stronger on the other side. And now, as they faced yet another threat, he knew that they would fight back with everything they had. A week later, the tension that had been building finally came to a head. It was late in the evening, and Victor and Emily were sitting in the living room, a fire crackling in the hearth, the warmth of the flames casting a golden glow across the room. They were talking quietly, their voices soft, the conversation filled with the hope and dreams they had for their future. Suddenly, there was a noise from outside, a loud crash, the sound of glass shattering. Emily's heart skipped a beat, her eyes widening as she looked at Victor, her breath catching in her throat. Victor stood immediately, his body tense, his eyes narrowing as he looked towards the front of the house. "Stay here," he said, his voice filled with urgency. He moved towards the door, his heart pounding, every instinct telling him that something was wrong. Emily felt her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing as she watched Victor move towards the door. She wanted to follow him to make sure he was safe, but she knew that he was trying to protect her, that he needed her to stay where she was. Victor opened the door to the hallway, his eyes scanning the darkened space. He could hear the sound of footsteps, the creak of the floorboards, and his heart sank. Someone was inside. He moved quietly, his body tense, his eyes adjusting to the darkness as he made his way towards the source of the noise. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. A man, his face obscured by a hood, his posture aggressive. Victor's breath caught in his throat, his body tensing as he faced the intruder. The man took a step forward, his voice filled with malice. "You should have backed down, Aster," he said, his words dripping with venom. "But now you're going to pay the price." Victor felt a surge of anger, his jaw clenching as he stepped forward, his voice steady. "Get out of my house," he said, his words filled with authority. "You have no business here." The intruder smirked, his eyes narrowing as he reached into his pocket, pulling out a knife. "Oh, I think I do," he replied, his voice cold. "You've made some powerful enemies, Aster, and they want you out of the picture." Victor's heart pounded, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way to protect Emily, to keep her safe. He knew that he couldn't let this man get any closer to her, that he had to end this now. Without a second thought, Victor lunged at the intruder, his body slamming into the man's, the force of the impact knocking them both to the ground. The knife clattered to the floor, sliding out of reach, and Victor fought with everything he had, his hands gripping the man's shoulders, his heart pounding in his ears. The struggle was intense, the sounds of their scuffle echoing through the hallway. Emily, hearing the commotion, couldn't stay put any longer. She rushed towards the noise, her heart pounding in her chest, fear gripping her as she saw Victor and the intruder grappling on the floor. Without thinking, Emily grabbed a heavy vase from a nearby table, her hands trembling as she raised it above her head. She moved closer, her eyes focused on the intruder, and with all her strength, she brought the vase down, the impact sending a loud crack through the hallway. The intruder slumped to the ground, his body going limp, and Victor looked up, his eyes wide with shock and relief as he saw Emily standing there, the vase still in her hands, her eyes filled with determination. "Emily," Victor whispered, his voice filled with emotion. He pushed himself to his feet, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her close. "You saved me." Emily felt tears streaming down her face, her heart pounding as she held onto Victor, her voice trembling. "I couldn't let him hurt you," she whispered. "I couldn't lose you, Victor." Victor held her tightly, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. He knew that they had faced their greatest challenge yet, that they had come face to face with the danger that had been lurking in the shadows, and they had come out stronger, together. As the police arrived, the flashing lights illuminating the estate, Victor and Emily stood together, their hands intertwined, their hearts filled with a sense of triumph. They had faced the darkness, they had fought back, and they had won. And now, as they looked towards the future, they knew that they could face whatever came their way. Together, with a love that was unbreakable, a bond that was stronger than anything the world could throw at them. The flashing lights of the police car slowly faded into the night as officers concluded their investigation. The man who had broken into the estate was escorted away, his face blank with defeat, and as he disappeared from sight, Victor felt a heavy weight lifting from his shoulders. It was over. At least for now, the immediate threat had passed, and they were safe. He could finally breathe again. Emily was sitting on the front steps of the estate, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes watching the officers as they moved about. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, her mind still reeling from everything that had happened. It had been terrifying, the kind of fear she had never experienced before. Seeing Victor fight for his life, knowing that at any moment he could be taken from her. But it had also been a turning point, a moment that had shown her just how strong their love was, how deeply they were connected. Victor approached her, his footsteps soft against the gravel, his eyes filled with concern as he looked at her. He sat down beside her, his hand reaching for hers, his fingers brushing against her skin. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle, filled with worry. Emily looked up at him, her eyes meeting his, and she managed a small smile. "I think so," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. She squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with love as she looked at the man who had risked everything to protect her. I'm so glad you're okay, Victor." Victor's gaze softened, his heart aching as he looked at her. He reached up, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that had slipped down her face. "I'm okay because of you, Emily," he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. "You saved my life tonight." Emily felt tears welling in her eyes, her heart overflowing with love and relief. She leaned into his touch, her forehead resting against his, her voice barely a whisper. "I couldn't let anything happen to you," she replied. "I love you, Victor. More than anything." Victor closed his eyes, his heart swelling with gratitude and love for the woman beside him. He leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, his voice filled with conviction. "And I love you, Emily, more than words can say." They sat there together, the night air cool around them, the estate now quiet, the tension slowly dissipating. It had been a night filled with fear, with danger, but they had come out stronger on the other side. They had faced their darkest moment and they had survived. And now, as they sat together, their hands intertwined, they knew that they could face anything, as long as they were together. The following days were a blur of recovery and reflection. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the memory of what had happened still lingered, a reminder of just how fragile life could be. Victor knew that they couldn't stay at the estate any longer, not after what had happened. It was no longer safe, and he couldn't risk putting Emily in danger again. After discussing it with Harold and the rest of his team, Victor made the decision to leave the country temporarily. He had properties abroad, places where they could lay low until things settled down, until they were certain that the danger had passed. It wasn't an easy decision. Donovan Manor had always been his home, a place filled with memories, both good and bad. But he knew that the most important thing was keeping Emily safe, and he would do whatever it took to protect her. Emily, for her part, was ready to go wherever Victor needed. She knew how much Donovan Manor meant to him, how difficult it was for him to leave, but she also knew that he was doing it for her, for them. And that was all that mattered. They packed their belongings, the process made easier by the fact that they hadn't brought much with them to the estate. Emily stood in their bedroom, her eyes scanning the space, her heart heavy with emotion. This place had been their refuge, a place where they had found comfort and safety, even if only for a short time. And now, they were leaving it behind, stepping into the unknown once again. Victor entered the room, his eyes softening as he saw Emily standing by the window, her gaze distant. He crossed the room, his arms wrapping around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. "You ready?" he asked, his voice gentle. Emily leaned back against him, her hands resting on his arms, her heart swelling with love for the man who had become her everything. "I'm ready," she replied softly. She turned her head, her eyes meeting his, a small smile playing on her lips. "As long as I'm with you, I'm ready for anything." Victor smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. He pressed a gentle kiss to her temple, his voice filled with love. "And I'm ready for anything as long as I have you." They left the estate early the next morning, the sun just beginning to rise over the hills, casting a golden glow across the landscape. The drive to the airport was quiet, both of them lost in their thoughts, the weight of everything that had happened still fresh in their minds. But there was also a sense of hope, a sense that they were stepping into a new chapter of their lives, one that would be filled with new challenges, but also new opportunities. The private jet that Victor had arranged was waiting for them, the engines already running, the crew ready to take off. Emily held Victor's hand tightly as they walked across the tarmac, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never been on a private jet before, never imagined that this would be her life, traveling across the world with a man who had come to mean everything to her. Victor helped her up the steps, his eyes filled with warmth as he looked at her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Emily nodded, her eyes meeting his, a small smile playing on her lips. "I'm okay," she replied. "Just a little nervous, I guess." Victor smiled, his hand resting on the small of her back as he led her into the cabin. "We're going to be okay, Emily," he said softly. "We're going to make it through this. Together." Emily looked at him, her heart swelling with love. She knew that he was right, that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, their love stronger than anything that tried to tear them apart. The days turned into weeks, and Victor and Emily settled into their new life abroad. They had chosen a villa in the south of France, a place surrounded by lush gardens and overlooking the sparkling Mediterranean Sea. It was a far cry from the chaos of their life back home, a place where they could finally breathe, where they could find some peace. Emily found herself falling in love with the simplicity of their new life. She spent her mornings in the garden, her afternoons exploring the nearby villages, and her evenings cooking dinner for Victor, the two of them sharing quiet moments together as the sun set over the horizon. It was a life that was far removed from the one she had known, but it was also a life that was filled with love, with joy, with the knowledge that they had each other. Victor, too, found a sense of peace in their new surroundings. For the first time in a long time, he was able to let go of the stress, the pressure, the constant need to be in control. He spent his days working on the foundation that he and Emily had started, using his resources to help those in need, to make a difference in the world. And he spent his nights with Emily, holding her close, knowing that she was the reason he had found the strength to keep going. One evening, as they sat on the terrace, a gentle breeze blowing in from the sea, Victor looked at Emily, his eyes filled with love. "You know," he began, his voice soft, "I used to think that my life was defined by my success, by the empire I had built. But now I know that none of that matters. The only thing that matters is you." Emily felt tears welling in her eyes, her heart swelling with emotion. She reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "And you're all that matters to me, Victor," she replied softly. "I don't need the wealth, or the power, or the influence. I just need you." Victor smiled, his eyes glistening with tears. He leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her lips, his heart swelling with love for the woman who had become his everything. "I love you, Emily," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "And I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know just how much." Emily smiled, her heart overflowing with love. "I love you too, Victor," she whispered, "more than anything." And as they sat there, the sun dipping below the horizon, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange, they knew that they had found something truly special, something that was worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for. They had faced the darkness together, and they had come out stronger on the other side. The future was still uncertain, but they knew one thing for certain. As long as they had each other, they could face anything. Their love was unbreakable, their bond stronger than anything the world could throw at them. And as they looked towards the future, they knew that it was filled with endless possibilities, with the promise of a life filled with love, with hope, and with the strength to face whatever came their way. Together, they had overcome the impossible, and together, they would build a future that was filled with love, with purpose, and with the knowledge that they had found something truly extraordinary in each other, and that, they knew, was worth everything. The early morning sun bathed the Mediterranean villa in a soft golden glow, illuminating the lush gardens and casting long shadows across the stone pathways. A gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine through the air, filling the villa with a fragrance that was both calming and invigorating. Emily stood on the terrace, her hands resting on the railing, her eyes focused on the horizon where the deep blue of the sea met the sky. It had been 6 months since she and Victor had left the United States, and in that time, they had found a sense of peace and tranquility that neither of them had thought possible. Life had slowed down in the best way. There were no more urgent meetings, no more threats lurking in the shadows, just the two of them, living each day as it came, cherishing each moment they had together. Emily had found joy in the simplicity of their life in France. She had taken up painting, spending her afternoons capturing the beauty of the sea and the gardens that surrounded the villa. She had also started volunteering at a local community center, helping to teach English to children from nearby villages. It was fulfilling work, and it gave her a sense of purpose, a way to give back to the world that had given her so much. Victor, too, had found a new rhythm to his life. He spent his mornings working on the foundation that he and Emily had started, using his resources to support causes that mattered to them: education, healthcare, opportunities for those who had been overlooked. It was work that gave him a sense of fulfillment, a way to use his influence for good. And when the work was done, he would join Emily in the garden or on the terrace, sharing quiet moments together as the day slipped into evening. As Emily stood there, her thoughts drifting, she heard the soft creak of the terrace door behind her. She turned, her face breaking into a smile as she saw Victor stepping out, his hair slightly tousled, his expression warm. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, the steam rising gently from the cups, and he made his way over to her, handing her one. "Good morning," Victor said, his voice soft as he leaned down to press a gentle kiss to her cheek. Emily smiled, her heart swelling with love for the man who had become her everything. "Good morning," she replied, her eyes meeting his. She took a sip of her coffee, her gaze returning to the horizon, the waves gently lapping at the shore in the distance. Victor stood beside her, his hand resting on the small of her back, his eyes also focused on the sea. There was a sense of contentment that had settled between them, a feeling that they were exactly where they were meant to be. They had faced so much together, so many challenges, so many moments of fear and uncertainty, and yet they had come out stronger on the other side. After a few moments of silence, Victor turned to Emily, his eyes filled with a mix of love and curiosity. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice gentle, "about our future." Emily looked up at him, her brow arching slightly, a smile playing on her lips. "Oh?" "What about our future?" she asked, her voice filled with warmth. Victor took a deep breath, his eyes searching hers. "I want to make this official, Emily," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I want to marry you. I want us to build a life together, not just here, but wherever life takes us. I want to make you my wife, for real this time." Emily felt her breath catch, her heart swelling with emotion. She looked at Victor, her eyes glistening with tears, her smile widening. "Victor," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Are you serious?" Victor nodded, his eyes filled with love and determination. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. He opened it, revealing a simple but elegant diamond ring, the stone catching the light of the morning sun. "I've never been more serious about anything in my life," he said softly. "Emily, will you marry me?" Emily felt tears streaming down her face, her heart overflowing with love for the man before her. She looked at the ring, then back at Victor, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes, Victor, I will marry you." Victor's face broke into a smile, his eyes glistening with tears as he slipped the ring onto her finger. He pulled her into his arms, his heart pounding in his chest as he held her close. "I love you, Emily," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "I love you more than anything." Emily held on to him tightly, her heart swelling with joy, her voice barely a whisper. "And I love you, Victor." More than words can say. The months that followed were filled with preparations for their wedding, a celebration that would mark the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. They chose to have the ceremony in the gardens of their villa, surrounded by the beauty of the flowers and the sea, with only a handful of their closest friends and loved ones in attendance. The day of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the sky a brilliant shade of blue, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers. Emily stood in the villa, her reflection staring back at her from the mirror, her heart pounding in her chest. She wore a simple white gown, the fabric flowing around her, her hair pinned back in loose curls. She felt a mixture of emotions, excitement, joy, and a hint of nervousness, but more than anything she felt a deep sense of love for the man she was about to marry. There was a soft knock on the door, and Emily turned, her face breaking into a smile as she saw her friend Claire standing there, her eyes filled with warmth. "Are you ready?" Claire asked, her voice filled with excitement. Emily took a deep breath, her smile widening. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," she replied. Claire nodded, her eyes glistening with tears as she reached for Emily's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You look beautiful, Emily," she said softly. "Victor is a very lucky man." Emily felt her heart swell, her eyes filled with emotion. "Thank you, Claire," she whispered. "I'm the lucky one." The ceremony was held in the garden, the chairs arranged in a semicircle around an archway covered in white roses. Victor stood at the front, his eyes focused on the path where Emily would soon appear. He wore a dark suit, his hair neatly styled, his expression a mixture of anticipation and love. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest, his eyes never leaving the villa. And then he saw her. Emily stepped out onto the path, her arm linked with Harold's, her eyes locked on Victor's. The world seemed to fade away, the guests, the flowers, the sea. All of it disappeared as she looked at the man she loved, the man she was about to marry. Her heart pounded in her chest, her eyes filled with tears, and she knew in that moment that she had found her forever. Victor felt his breath catch, his eyes widening as he watched Emily make her way towards him. She looked radiant, her smile lighting up the entire garden, her eyes filled with love. He could feel his heart swelling, his chest tightening with emotion, and he knew that this was the moment he had been waiting for his entire life. As Emily reached the front, Harold gave her a gentle smile, placing her hand in Victor's before stepping back. Victor looked at Emily, his eyes meeting hers, his voice barely a whisper. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice filled with emotion. Emily smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "And you look handsome," she replied softly. The officiant began the ceremony, his words a blur to Emily as she stood there, her hands in Victor's, her heart filled with love. She listened as Victor spoke his vows, his voice steady, his eyes never leaving hers. He spoke of his love for her, of the challenges they had faced, of the future they would build together. And as he spoke, Emily felt tears streaming down her face, her heart overflowing with emotion. When it was her turn, Emily took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she spoke. She spoke of the man she had come to love, the man who had shown her what true strength was, the man who had stood by her through every challenge, every moment of fear and uncertainty. She spoke of her love for him, a love that was unbreakable, a love that would carry them through whatever lay ahead. When the officiant finally spoke the words they had been waiting for, declaring them husband and wife, Victor leaned in, his lips meeting Emily's in a gentle, loving kiss. The guests erupted into applause, the sound of their cheers echoing through the garden. But for Victor and Emily, there was only each other, only the love that had brought them to this moment, the love that would carry them forward. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange, Victor and Emily stood together on the terrace, their hands intertwined, their hearts filled with joy. The celebration had been perfect, filled with laughter, with love, with the warmth of their closest friends. And now, as the day came to an end, they stood together, looking out at the sea, the future stretching out before them. Victor turned to Emily, his eyes filled with love. "You know," he began, his voice soft, "I used to think that my life was defined by what I had accomplished, by my success, my wealth. But now, I know that none of that matters. The only thing that matters is you, Emily. You are my heart, my soul, my everything." Emily felt tears welling in her eyes, her heart swelling with emotion. She reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "And you are mine," she replied softly. "We've faced so much, Victor, and we've come out stronger on the other side. I know that as long as we have each other, we can face anything." Victor smiled, his eyes glistening with tears. He leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, his voice filled with love. "And we will," he whispered. "Together, we will face whatever comes our way. Our love is unbreakable, Emily, and I will spend the rest of my life showing you just how much you mean to me." Emily smiled, her heart overflowing with love. She looked out at the horizon, her eyes focused on the waves gently lapping at the shore. "And I will spend the rest of my life loving you, Victor," she whispered. More than words can say. And as they stood there, the world quiet around them, they knew that they had found something truly special, a love that had been forged through hardship, through triumph, through every challenge they had faced. It was a love that was unbreakable, a bond that was stronger than anything the world could throw at them. The future was still uncertain, but as they looked towards it, they knew one thing for certain. They had each other, and that was enough. Together, they would face whatever lay ahead, their hearts filled with hope, with love, and with the strength to build a future that was filled with endless possibilities. And that, they knew, was worth everything.